The gun was already in Cyrus Wallace's hand when Delia Hurst stepped through the door of the Painted Rock Sheriff's office, and the look on his face told her everything she had feared since the moment she had ridden into this territory 6 weeks ago. He knew, or he thought he knew, which in the New Mexico territory of 1878 amounted to exactly the same thing, because the land here did not wait for a man to gather all his facts before it began extracting its consequences. "You lied to me," he said, and his voice was low and flat and dangerous in the way that only voices trained by years of hard experience could be. The oil lamp on his desk threw amber light across the sharp planes of his face, across the badge pinned to his chest, across the hand that held the revolver not quite aimed at her, but not quite not aimed at her either. Delia did not flinch. She had used up all her flinching in another life, in another state, in the ruins of a marriage that had taught her what betrayal actually tasted like. She stepped fully into the room and let the door swing shut behind her, and she held his gaze the way a woman holds onto the only solid thing in a flood. "I did not lie to you," she said. "I left things out. There is a difference. Not out here there isn't." He set the gun down on the desk, which was almost worse than if he had kept holding it, because it meant his hands were now free, and he was trusting his own anger not to need a weapon. "The territory does not forgive mistakes, Delia. I've told you that. I've told every soul who came through here chasing some fresh start like it was a thing you could just pick up at the general store. The land takes what it takes and it does not give it back." She looked at him across the space between them, across the months of almost and the weeks of something that had begun to feel like hope, and she felt the particular heartbreak of watching a good man decide he was protecting himself from her. "I know what the territory does," she said. "I have made my mistakes, Cyrus, every one of them, and I am done with them. That is what I came here to tell you. Not because you deserve an explanation, though maybe you do, but because I deserve to say it out loud to the one person it actually matters to." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Delia Hurst had ever heard. It had started, as most stories of dark pasts and hidden motives do, much more quietly than this. Delia had arrived in Painted Rock on the 3rd day of September in 1878, on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe, with one leather trunk, a carpet bag, a letter of employment from the Territorial Schoolteachers Board, and a name that was technically her own, but had been preceded for the last 4 years by a different one. She had been Delia Marchetti for those 4 years, married to a man named Vincent Marchetti, who ran a freighting operation out of Albuquerque and ran it. She had eventually discovered, with the kind of creative accounting that depended on the fact that his wife trusted him completely and therefore never looked at the ledgers. She had looked at the ledgers on a Tuesday in April, because Vincent had left them on the kitchen table when he went to conduct business at the saloon, and what she had found there had dismantled the 4 years of her marriage the way a hammer dismantles a mirror, all at once and into too many pieces to ever reassemble. The freighting operation was legitimate on its surface. Underneath it, Vincent Marchetti was moving stolen livestock for a cattle ring that operated across 3 territories. The men whose names appeared in the hidden columns of that ledger were men with wanted posters, men with blood on their hands, men who would not appreciate a woman who could read finding out their business arrangements. Delia had done 2 things. She had taken the ledger, and she had left. She had not gone to the authorities in Albuquerque, because 2 of the names in the ledger were men who worked inside the sheriff's office there. She had gone, instead, to Santa Fe, to a lawyer named Garrett who had handled her family's affairs back in Missouri before she had come west. Garrett had listened, had examined the ledger, had advised her very carefully and with great precision that what she held in her hands was either the most valuable or the most dangerous document in the territory, depending entirely on how she chose to use it. And then he had helped her disappear into a new teaching position in a town small enough that the cattle ring's reach was unlikely to extend to it. Painted Rock, New Mexico Territory. Population 412. Sheriff's office staffed by 1 sheriff and 1 deputy. The sheriff was Cyrus Wallace. She had met him on her second day in town, when she had gone to the general store run by a woman named Marjorie Alcott to purchase chalk and a decent supply of writing paper for the schoolroom. The store occupied the ground floor of a broad adobe building on the main street, and Cyrus Wallace had been standing at the counter when Delia walked in, discussing a supply delivery with Marjorie in the unhurried way of a man who had all the authority in a small town and was perfectly comfortable with it. He was 32 years old, tall and lean in the way that suggested he had worked hard his whole life and eaten simply. His hair was dark brown, cut short, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had weathered things and come through them changed but not broken. There was a steadiness about him that Delia noticed immediately, the way you notice the stillness at the center of something that could otherwise move very fast. He had tipped his hat to her when Marjorie introduced them, and said he was glad the school finally had a new teacher, and that if she needed anything she should not hesitate to come find him. It was the sort of thing a sheriff said to a newcomer out of professional courtesy, and Delia had thanked him with equal professionalism and turned her attention to chalk. But he had held the door open for her on her way out, and in the brief moment when she passed close enough to him to smell the leather and sage of his presence, something moved in the cautious interior she had been guarding so carefully since April, and she did not like it at all, because she had come to Painted Rock to hide and to teach and to be quiet, not to feel things about the local law enforcement. She began teaching on the following Monday. The school was a single room of adobe and timber on the eastern edge of town, with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and Delia threw herself into the work with the kind of focused energy that comes from having decided that work is the only safe harbor. She organized the students by level, not by age, established a reading circle in the mornings and arithmetic in the afternoons, and stayed late each evening to prepare the following day's lessons by the light of 2 tallow candles she had purchased from Marjorie Alcott's store. Cyrus Wallace walked past the school each evening on his rounds. She became aware of this in the second week, when she happened to be standing at the window reviewing a map she had pinned to the wall and saw his silhouette moving along the street with the deliberate, unhurried gait she was already recognizing as distinctively his. He did not stop. He did not look in the window, but on the third evening he paused outside the door long enough to knock once lightly, and when she opened it he held out a small tin lantern. "Safer than candles," he said, without preamble. Adobe catches slower than timber, but the smoke from a candle fire can be just as bad. This one burns coal oil. Marjorie keeps it stocked. Delia looked at the lantern, then at him, and felt the cautious interior move again. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "Cyrus," he said, "if you're going to be here a while, there's not much point in formality." She had taken the lantern and said his name for the first time, and he had nodded and resumed his rounds, and that was how it had begun, in the smallest possible way, through a simple act of practical consideration that she knew she should not read anything into and read everything into anyway. October came to the territory with a change of sky that transformed the landscape from its summer brutality into something that was still dangerous, but also, grudgingly, beautiful. The light went golden and the air lost its killing edge, and the mountains in the distance turned purple at dusk, and Delia found that she was beginning to know the rhythms of Painted Rock in the way you begin to know a place that might, if you are careful and lucky, eventually let you call it home. She had not had a home since Missouri. Her parents were dead. She had a brother in Kansas City who knew she had left Vincent but did not know the particulars and was, in any case, too occupied with his own family to involve himself in hers. She was 27 years old, and she had made the significant mistake of marrying a man she had not known well enough, and she had made the secondary mistake of not examining that lack of knowledge carefully enough until it was too late, and she was not going to make any more mistakes of that particular variety. She had decided this in Santa Fe, in Garrett's office, and she had not wavered from it. Which made the specific situation with Cyrus Wallace inconvenient, because he was not behaving like a mistake. He was behaving like something else entirely. It was not obvious. It was never obvious with him. He was not the sort of man who made declarations or pushed toward anything. He was the sort of man who appeared, quietly useful, at the edges of situations that required quiet usefulness, and who listened more than he spoke, and who had the particular quality of making a person feel heard without requiring them to say anything more than they intended to. He came into the habit of stopping at the school in the evenings, not always, perhaps 3 times a week, and they would talk for a quarter of an hour while she finished her preparations. He asked her about the students and she told him about them. The quiet ferocity of a girl named Rosa who was reading 3 levels above her age. The stubbornness of a boy named Thomas who was 13 and had decided he was too old for school but whose father, a rancher named Holt, had told him he would attend until he turned 16 or until the schoolteacher said he knew enough, whichever came first. He told her about the territory, not its dangers particularly, though those came up, but its history, its geography, the particular character of the land in each direction from town. He told her about the Mescalero Apache, whose traditional territories overlapped with the eastern ranges, and he spoke of them without the contempt she had heard from others in town, speaking instead of the specific injustice of what had been done to their lands, and the complexity of navigating a space where federal policy and human reality existed in painful contradiction. He told her about a man named Tosca, a respected elder of one of the local bands, with whom he had worked out an arrangement that kept the peace around Painted Rock with more honesty than the usual methods employed by territorial authorities. She filed this away because it told her something important about who he was. He asked her once in the 3rd week of October why she had come to Painted Rock specifically. She had prepared for this question. She had prepared a version of the truth that was true in all its parts but incomplete in its totality, the way a map can be accurate without showing everything that exists on the ground. She told him she had been in Albuquerque, that she had left a marriage that had not worked, that she had wanted a smaller and simpler place. She said she was a good teacher, and that the territory needed good teachers and that Painted Rock had needed one particularly. He had listened to all of this with that quality of attention he had, and then he said, "What was his name?" She had looked at him sharply. "The man you were married to," he said. He was not asking out of nosiness. His voice was careful and gentle, the way his voice got when he was asking something he thought might land somewhere sore. "Vincent Marchetti," she said, because she had no reason not to say it. "He was a freighter out of Albuquerque." Something moved across his face, very briefly, so briefly she might have imagined it. And then it was gone, and he nodded and said he was sorry she had gone through that, and the conversation moved on. She had not imagined it. She knew that, in the way that you know things you cannot prove. But she did not know what it meant, not yet, and she filed it alongside the information about Tosca and the Mescalero, and told herself that the filing system she was building for Cyrus Wallace was proof of exactly what she was trying not to do with him. She was failing. She knew that too. The Halloween social happened on the last Friday of October, organized by the Church Women's Committee and held in the largest of the town's 2 saloons, the one owned by a man named Briggs who had converted half of it into a community space by the simple expedient of moving the card tables out onto the front porch for the evening. There was food, there was dancing to a fiddle and a second-hand piano, and there was the particular communal warmth of a small town that has decided, for one evening, to put aside whatever grievances it has been nursing and simply enjoy itself. Delia went because not going would have been more conspicuous than going. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had bought in Santa Fe before coming here because it was practical and warm and happened also to be a color that suited her, with her brown hair pinned up and her only piece of good jewelry, a small garnet brooch that had been her mother's, pinned at her collar. Cyrus Wallace was there in his off-duty capacity, which meant his badge was the same but his bearing was slightly less official, and he was wearing a clean dark shirt and had the look of a man who cleaned up well but did not make a particular point of it. He was talking to the rancher Holt when Delia arrived, and he saw her come in, and across the room something shifted in his expression in a way that made her walk very carefully to where Marjorie Alcott was standing so that she would have something to do with her hands. He asked her to dance in the second hour of the evening, after the fiddle player shifted from a fast reel to something slower and more deliberate. He asked with the same directness he brought to everything, not with false casualness or elaborate preamble, just, would she like to dance? And she said yes, because by October she had already stopped pretending to herself that she was going to maintain a purely professional distance from this man. They danced on the plank floor of the converted saloon while the oil lamp swayed, and the fiddle made something sweet and melancholy out of the October air, and his hand was warm at her waist, and he held her correctly, with exactly the right measure of propriety and closeness. She was aware of every point where they almost touched and the few points where they did, and she was aware of his face above hers when they were near enough, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his expression in an unguarded moment was different from his expression when he was being the sheriff, softer and more uncertain and more real. "You look like someone who isn't sure they're allowed to enjoy themselves," he said. Delia laughed, which surprised her. "That's a very specific observation." "I'm observant," he said. "It was not a boast. It was just a fact. It helps in my line of work. And in dancing, I'm not sure I'm in a position to evaluate my dancing objectively." She found she was smiling in a way she had not smiled in a long time, the real kind, the kind that arrived before you decided it was safe to let it. And he was looking at her with an expression that was still careful but no longer at all distant, and she thought, standing there in the converted saloon in the small town where she had come to hide, that she was in a great deal of trouble. They walked back to the schoolhouse together after the social, because it was on his route and she was carrying her lantern, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars in a quantity that the Missouri sky had never managed. They walked close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. They talked about nothing consequential. He stopped at the door of the schoolhouse and said good night, and she said good night, and they looked at each other for a moment that was longer than a professional good night required, and then he touched the brim of his hat and walked away. She went inside and sat down on the teacher's chair and told herself she was going to have to tell him something about Vincent eventually, more than she had said, because whatever this was building into, it was building on ground she had not cleared, and the foundation was therefore not sound. She told herself this, and then told herself that there was nothing yet to tell him, really, that there was nothing between them that required disclosure, that she was imagining the weight of something that might be nothing. She did not believe any of it. November arrived, and with it, a development that forced the question she had been managing to avoid. A man rode into Painted Rock on the 9th of November on a bay horse that had been ridden hard, and he went directly to the sheriff's office. His name was Alderman Pike, and he was a deputy federal marshal out of Las Cruces, and he was looking for information on a cattle ring that had been operating through Albuquerque. Delia did not know this until 2 days later, when Marjorie Alcott mentioned it across the counter of the general store in the way that news traveled in small towns, as a side item to the main transaction, attached to the sale of a pound of dried beans and a spool of thread. A federal man had come through. He was asking about some big operation in Albuquerque. It was all very interesting. Delia took her beans and her thread and walked back to the schoolhouse and sat for a long time looking at the wall where she had pinned the map. The ledger was in her trunk. She had not left it with Garrett because Garrett had told her that it would be safer with her for the time being, that the men named in it had reached inside the federal system, and that the timing of its introduction as evidence needed to be managed carefully. She had carried it across 2 territories in the false bottom of her leather trunk, and it had weighed on her conscience every day since April in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the constant calculation of risk. She needed to talk to Cyrus. She did not go to him immediately. She was a careful woman, and she had been careful all her life, and the very quality of her carefulness was what had made her survival since April possible. But it was also, she recognized in her more honest moments, a quality that could curdle into something that kept her isolated and still when movement was what the situation required. She waited 2 days, thinking it through, and then she went to the sheriff's office on a Thursday afternoon, between the end of the school day and the beginning of his evening rounds. He was at his desk, writing a report, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it did now when he saw her, that small, unguarded shift of expression that she was not sure he knew he was doing. "Delia," he said, "something wrong." "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I should probably have told you before this, but I didn't know how to, and I wasn't sure it was my business to, and I was being cautious." He put his pen down and gave her his full attention, which with Cyrus was not a metaphorical thing. He actually stopped every other thing he was doing and looked at her and listened. She told him about the ledger. Not about Vincent in more detail than she had already given, but about what she had found, what it contained, what she had taken and why, where it was now. She told him about Garrett in Santa Fe and about the federal investigation that had apparently reached the territory ahead of schedule. She told him that she had not gone to the Albuquerque authorities because of the 2 names in the ledger that she recognized as belonging to men who worked there. When she finished, the silence in the office was very still. "You have this ledger," he said, "here in painted rock." "Yes, and you've been carrying it since April." "Yes." He stood up from behind his desk and walked to the window and stood looking out at the street for a long moment, and Delia watched his back and could not read what was happening there, whether it was anger or something else, something more complicated. "The marshal who came through," he said. "Alderman Pike. He mentioned the name Marchetti." And there it was, the thing that had moved across his face in October when she said Vincent's name. He had already known, or suspected, or had a piece of the picture that he had been holding quietly while he waited for the rest of it to arrive. "What did he say?" Delia asked. "That Marchetti's operation is bigger than they thought." He turned from the window. "That there's a woman missing from the picture, a wife." He looked at her steadily. He described her. The room got very quiet. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "Not from me," he said immediately, and the immediacy of it, the way there was no pause at all between her question and his answer, told her something so important about him that she had to look away for a moment so that her face would not show everything she felt about it. "But potentially from others," he said, because he was honest and she needed honesty more than she needed comfort. "If Marchetti's people are looking for the ledger and they have any kind of intelligence network, they may have tracked you further than Santa Fe." She told him she understood. "I want to see it," he said. "The ledger, not because I don't believe you, but because if I'm going to help you, I need to know exactly what we're working with." She noted the word "we" and did not say anything about it. She brought the ledger to him the following morning, and he spent 3 hours with it. And then he wrote a letter to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, and another to Alderman Pike in Las Cruces, and then he came to the school at the end of the day and told her what he had decided, which was that the safest course was to get the ledger into federal hands as quickly and quietly as possible, and that he would personally escort her to Santa Fe to do it if she was willing. "I can make my own way," she said, because she had been making her own way for 8 months and she had not broken yet. "I know you can," he said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise. But you shouldn't have to, and I'd like to go with you." He paused. "Also, 2 of the names in that ledger are men I've been trying to put a case together on for 2 years. This is not entirely about you." She had laughed at that, the honest laugh again, the one that arrived before she decided it was safe. "That's the most useful thing you could have said." "I thought it might be," he said, and he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen his smile without any reservation in it at all. And she understood then that she was already in love with him, had probably been in love with him since October, and that this was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she found that ledger. They left for Santa Fe on a Monday, with the ledger in a leather case that Cyrus kept in his own saddlebag because he was a sheriff, and therefore a harder target for anyone who might be watching. They rode because the stage was too public and too predictable, and the 2-day ride through the territory gave Delia her first extended time alone with him outside of Painted Rock, without the town as backdrop and context, just the two of them and the road and the enormous sky. He was different on the trail, not different in character, but different in the particular way that people who are always performing some version of themselves for a community relax when that community is not present. He was quieter and simultaneously more communicative, if that made sense, and it made sense to Delia because she was the same way. He told her things about his life that she had not known, that he had grown up in Arkansas, that he had come west at 20 after a brief and unsuccessful career as a schoolteacher himself, which made her laugh again, that he had worked as a ranch hand for 3 years before a territorial marshal had recruited him, that he had been in Painted Rock for 4 years and had not in that time met anyone who made him want to be anywhere else. He said that last thing in the early evening of the first day, when they had made camp beside a creek, and the fire was burning low, and the stars were coming out, and she was sitting across the fire from him drinking coffee that he had made because he was better at it on the trail than she was. He said it quietly, without looking at her, looking at the fire, and she knew he meant her, meant that he had not met anyone who made him want to be anywhere else until he met her. And the way he said it, without drama or expectation, just as a plain fact he was offering her to do with what she chose, undid something in her that had been very tightly knotted for a very long time. "I didn't come here to find this," she said. She meant him. She meant whatever was happening between them. She needed him to know she had not engineered it. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." He looked up from the fire and across at her, and in the firelight his face was very serious and very open. "Does that bother you?" "It frightens me," she said, because she was done lying even by omission to this man. "I made a mistake in judgment once before, a significant one. I'm not interested in making another." "Neither am I," he said, "which means we go carefully." He was quiet for a moment. "But I'd rather go carefully forward than not go at all." She held his gaze across the fire and felt the particular quality of something irrevocable beginning. "Carefully forward," she said. "Yes." They reached Santa Fe on the second evening and went directly to the federal marshal's office, where a surprised and then extremely interested marshal named Collier received the ledger and spent 2 hours with Cyrus going through its contents, while Delia sat in the outer office and answered every question that Collier put to her with a precision she had been practicing since April. Alderman Pike arrived the following morning. He was a small, lean man with sharp eyes and the particular competence of someone who had done dangerous work long enough that it had stopped appearing dangerous to him. He shook Delia's hand and told her she had done exactly the right thing in preserving the ledger and bringing it forward, and then he told her, without softening it, that the situation was not over. Vincent Marchetti had been arrested in October on lesser charges, while the larger investigation built its case. He was out on bond. 2 of his associates, men whose names appeared in the hidden columns of the ledger, were not in custody. Their names were Garrett Briggs and a man called Dutch Selden, and they were the 2 that Cyrus had been building a case on for 2 years, and they were also, Alderman Pike believed, aware that a ledger existed and aware that it had disappeared at the same time as Marchetti's wife. "They may not know where you are," Pike said, "but they have resources." "She's been living in Painted Rock for 6 weeks, Cyrus said. There was a flat, controlled quality to his voice that Delia had not heard before. "Then the sooner we move on this, the better," Pike said. "With this ledger, we have enough to arrest Briggs and Selden. The question is the timing." They planned it over the course of the day, Cyrus and Pike and Collier, and Delia sat in the room because it was her life, and she was not going to be in the next room while it was decided, and nobody suggested she should be. Cyrus did not suggest it. This was something she would always remember. The plan was for Delia to return to Painted Rock with Cyrus, to continue her normal life there while Pike built the arrest case. The ledger would remain with the federal office. If Briggs and Selden were located before they located her, the arrests would happen and the situation would be resolved. If they showed up in Painted Rock first, Cyrus would be there. "She'll be safe," Cyrus said to Pike, and it was not a question or a request. It was a statement of what he intended to make true. They rode back to Painted Rock, and somewhere in the second day of that return ride, Delia stopped thinking about it as hiding and started thinking about it as home. The weeks that followed were the most complicated of her adult life, in the specific way that complexity arising from two different sources simultaneously is more difficult than either source would be alone. The first source was the practical matter of the investigation, which proceeded at the slow and agonizing pace of federal machinery, with occasional letters from Pike that said progress was being made without specifying what progress looked like. The second source was Cyrus, and the way their carefully forward movement was becoming, in the quiet hours of evenings at the schoolhouse and the long walks that had become a habit and the conversations that went longer than either of them planned, something that felt less like a direction and more like an arrival. She taught her students. Rosa's reading was now astonishing, and Delia began staying later to work with her individually, feeding the girls' hunger with every book she could beg or borrow from Painted Rock's modest library. Thomas Holt stopped pretending he was too old for school sometime in November and began asking her questions about mathematics with the fierce concentration of a boy who has discovered that he is genuinely good at something. She wrote to her brother in Kansas City for the first time since leaving Albuquerque, a careful letter that did not say everything, but said she was well and in a good place, and had found something that felt like solid ground. She was careful not to be obvious about Cyrus, and he was careful not to be obvious about her, and both of them were very bad at it, because Painted Rock was a small town and Marjorie Alcott had eyes like a hawk and a social network like a telegraph system. "He hasn't looked at a woman since his wife died 3 years ago," Marjorie told Delia in the middle of November, deploying this information over the counter of the general store with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to deploy it. Delia's expression very carefully did not change. "I wasn't aware he'd been married." "Clara," Marjorie said. "Fever, in the spring of '75. They'd been married 2 years. He hasn't been the same." She looked at Delia with the frank assessment of a woman who has decided to be direct because indirection is wasteful. "Until recently." Delia took her purchases and her newly acquired information and walked back to the school and thought about a woman named Clara she had never met and what it cost a man like Cyrus to begin something again after that kind of loss. She asked him about Clara that evening when he stopped at the school on his rounds. She asked carefully, leaving him space to answer or not, and he answered because he was not a man who hid from things that were real. He told her about Clara in the way that people tell you about the most important losses they have carried, with brevity and exactness, and a kind of careful love for the details. Clara had been from Texas, had been 24 when she died, had had a way of laughing at things that still appeared to him, sometimes in the quality of light on a particular kind of afternoon. He had not expected to be happy again in the specific way that Clara had made him happy, and he was still getting used to the idea that he might be. "You don't have to be," Delia said. "I mean, get used to it in any particular direction." "I know," he said, "but I want to." He looked at her directly. "That's the difference." They were sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse in the cold November air, close enough together that she could feel the warmth of him at her side, and she leaned, very slightly, into that warmth, and he let her. And for a while they sat together in the dark looking at the stars and not saying anything at all, and it was the most peaceful she had felt since Missouri. She kissed him for the first time in December, on a Saturday afternoon when she had gone to his office to bring him a report from Pike that had arrived in her name, because Pike had discovered that letters addressed to a woman in Painted Rock attracted less attention than letters addressed to the sheriff. He read the report and looked up at her across his desk and said that it looked like they might have a location on Briggs, and she felt the weight of that, of all of it, of 8 months of carrying something too big and too dangerous, and she said, "When this is over, I'm going to be very boring for a very long time." He said, "That sounds like exactly what you deserve." And she said, "What do you think you deserve?" And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he got up from behind his desk and came around it, and she met him halfway, because she was done being cautious in this one particular respect, and she kissed him standing in the middle of the sheriff's office in Painted Rock, with the afternoon light coming in through the single window, and he kissed her back with a thorough and careful tenderness that made her understand that this was a man who did not do anything carelessly, not even this. When they separated, he was still holding her face gently in both hands, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was relief and want, and the particular happiness of a person who had stopped expecting good things and is therefore more undone by one than most. "I've been thinking about doing that since the Halloween social," he said. She said, "So have I." December progressed. The letters from Pike continued. Briggs was located in a town called Mesilla. Selden was proving more elusive. Vincent Marchetti, out on bond, was apparently still in Albuquerque, and his name in the letters from Pike had a different quality now, a quality of something being closed rather than something ongoing, which Delia understood to mean that the federal case against him was solidifying without requiring anything more from her. She and Cyrus were, in the particular and slightly absurd formality of 1878 Frontier Social Convention, courting. This meant that what they felt for each other was understood by most of Painted Rock, but that the expression of it in public was constrained to walking together, eating Sunday dinner at Marjorie's kitchen table alongside half the town, and the occasional highly observed conversation on Main Street. What it was in private was warmer and more real, and the thing that occupied the considerable intelligence Delia would otherwise have applied to avoiding feeling it. He told her things about the territory in those December evenings that were both practical and, she thought, intended to make her love the place he had already committed his life to. He told her about the particular quality of winter here, the way it could turn savage and then ease into something almost gentle within the same week. He told her about the springs to the east where wild horses came to water, a sight he had seen once 3 years ago and still thought about. He told her about the agreement he maintained with Tosca of the Mescalero, and she asked to meet Tosca, and he said he would take her in the spring if the situation had resolved. "You plan to still be here in the spring," she said. It was not a challenge, it was an inquiry. "I plan to be here considerably past the spring," he said. He looked at her steadily. "The question is whether you do." She thought about that, about the teaching contract that ran through the school year, about the trunk with the false bottom that now contained only clothing, about the students, Rosa and Thomas and the others, and the schoolroom she had organized and made into something real, about the small town that had let her work and breathe and begin, quietly, to put herself back together, about him. "I don't have a reason to leave," she said, and the honesty of it was so total that she felt exposed by it, in the way that you feel exposed by truth that you have been carrying so long as a question that saying it as an answer lands like something physical. "Good," he said simply, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his. January brought the crisis she had been waiting for, not from the direction she expected, but from directions that converged on the same point. It started with a stranger who rode into town on the 14th and took a room at the Single Hotel, a man who said his name was Crawford and that he was in the area looking at land. He was thin and fair-haired and had the look of someone performing a role, and Cyrus clocked him within an hour of his arrival with the instinct of 4 years of watching people come and go through a small town and knowing which ones were what they said they were. He told Delia that evening. He told her carefully, without alarm, laying it out as information. He did not tell her to be careful in a way that suggested she needed to be managed. He told her to be alert and to vary her routine and to send him word immediately if anything felt wrong. "Is it Selden?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "It might be nothing, but I want you to know I'm watching." The second strand arrived 2 days later, in the form of a letter from Pike that arrived in Delia's name and that she brought to Cyrus immediately. Selden had been seen heading north from Albuquerque. Briggs had been arrested. The arrests were proceeding, but Selden was loose and his last known direction was toward the upper territory, toward Painted Rock. "He knows where you are," Cyrus said. "He was very still in the way he got very still when something required his full capability." "The man at the hotel," Delia said, "probably sent ahead to confirm you were here." He stood up from his desk. "I need to send a wire to Pike. And then we wait, but carefully." He looked at her. "I'm going to ask you to stay at Marjorie's tonight, rather than the schoolhouse. She has a proper bolt on the door and 2 sons who can handle themselves." Delia did not argue, because she was not foolish, and because this was not the moment for independence to be more important than safety. She went to Marjorie's, and Marjorie fed her supper and asked no questions, and made up a cot in the back room with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has lived on the frontier long enough that crisis management is simply a household skill. Crawford, whoever he was, disappeared from the hotel on the 3rd day, which was either reassuring or more alarming depending on how you read it. Cyrus read it as more alarming and doubled his rounds and deputized the rancher Holt's oldest son, a 20-year-old named Jacob who was calm and capable and could ride fast if needed. The wire from Pike arrived on the 17th. Selden had been tracked to a small settlement 12 miles east of Painted Rock. Pike was 3 days out with 2 deputy marshals. He asked Cyrus to hold the situation for 72 hours. Cyrus sent back, "I will hold it." Delia went back to the schoolhouse because the children needed to be taught, and she was not going to stop being herself because a dangerous man was nearby. She taught the morning session with the calm that she had developed over 8 months of carrying something dangerous, and at noon, she let the students go for lunch and stood at the window looking at the street. And that was when she saw the man who was not Crawford but who had the same quality of being something other than what he appeared walking along the far side of the street looking at the schoolhouse. She moved away from the window. She went to the back of the school and out the rear door, which opened onto the alley between the school and the neighboring building. And she went down the alley to the street and along the street to the sheriff's office and walked in without knocking. Cyrus was there, and his deputy, a young man named Sam who was 22 and serious, and he took one look at her face and was on his feet immediately. She told him what she had seen. He told Sam to stay in the office and came with her back up the street, and they were halfway there when the man she had seen appeared at the end of the block. He was stocky and red-haired and had the particular quality of stillness of someone who has decided what they are about to do, and he looked at Delia and at Cyrus and at the badge on Cyrus's chest, and then he made the calculation that was either very brave or very stupid and reached for the gun at his hip. Cyrus was faster. Not because he was itching to draw, but because he was always prepared for the moment when he had to be. His voice was quiet and utterly authoritative as he said, "Don't." The man stopped. Not because he was afraid, but because the quality of Cyrus's voice in that moment communicated, with perfect clarity, that this was not a man who would miss. "Put your hands up," Cyrus said, "and we'll handle this without anyone getting hurt." The man raised his hands slowly, and Cyrus crossed the distance between them and had him disarmed and secured with practiced efficiency. And Jacob Holt appeared from around the corner, because he had been on the far side of the block and had seen it all, and he helped Cyrus walk the man back to the office. His name was not Crawford. It was Devereaux, and he was one of Selden's men, and under questioning he admitted that Selden was at the settlement 12 miles east and was planning to come for the ledger. "The ledger isn't here," Cyrus told him. Devereaux blinked, something recalculated behind his eyes. "That's right," Cyrus said. "It's been in the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe for 2 months. Whatever you were sent here to recover, it is already gone." He leaned across the desk. "And whatever you were sent here to do to the woman who carried it, I suggest you reconsider very carefully whether the man who sent you is worth it." He sent Jacob to wire Pike immediately. Devereaux stayed in the jail cell. And then Cyrus came and found Delia, who was sitting in the outer office with her hands flat on her knees, and he sat down beside her and said, "Are you all right?" "I will be," she said. "I will be when it's finished." "It's almost finished," he said. He put his hand over hers on her knee. "Pike will have Selden before the week is out." He was right. Pike and his deputies moved on the eastern settlement 2 days later, and Dutch Selden was taken without significant incident, and the wire that arrived at Painted Rock on the morning of January 22nd said, "Selden in custody. Case proceeding to prosecution. Miss Hurst may consider the matter closed." Delia read the wire standing in the sheriff's office, and when she got to the last sentence she felt something she had not felt since before April, since before the ledger and the marriage and the flight and the months of careful survival. She felt light. Simply, purely, unremarkably light. As though the weight she had been carrying had existed so long she had stopped noticing it until it was gone, and the absence was extraordinary. She looked up at Cyrus, who was watching her. "It's done," she said. And he said, "Yes." And then she cried, which she had not done in 8 months, not once, because crying had been a luxury she could not afford when so much had depended on her keeping herself together. She cried with her hands over her face, and he waited, without rushing her or trying to stop her. And then when she lowered her hands, he pulled her in and held her with the steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him, solid and patient and absolutely present. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. "I told myself I wouldn't do this," she said, muffled. "I know," he said. His chin was against the top of her head. "You've been very impressive." She laughed and cried at the same time, which was an undignified combination, and she didn't care at all. That was the day of January 22nd, 1879, and it was also, though she did not know it yet, the beginning of the part of her life that she would look back on from much later as the real one, the one that had not yet been built when she arrived in Painted Rock, that she had built with her own hands and this man's steady presence beside her, stone by stone, on ground she had gradually learned to trust. She had to teach. She taught through February with the particular freedom of a person who has put down a burden and is discovering what it is like to simply walk. Her students noticed a change in her they could not have named, a kind of ease, a lightness in the classroom that translated into better lessons and more laughter, and a teaching session one Friday afternoon that was so absorbed and alive that the children stayed 20 minutes past dismissal because they were all, teachers and students alike, genuinely interested in what they were exploring. Cyrus came to the school that Friday evening and found her still at the blackboard, chalk in hand, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment with an expression that she saw when she turned, and that made her understand, fully and without any remaining reservation, that this was what she wanted and what she intended to have. They walked that evening all the way to the eastern edge of town and up the low hill that gave a view of the valley, and they sat on a flat rock in the February cold, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they watched the last of the light leave the sky. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "Not yet," he said, which made her look up at him. His expression was the careful, serious one. "I want to ask it correctly. I just want you to know it's coming." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at the valley and said, "I'll be ready." He asked it correctly on a Sunday in March, at Marjorie Alcott's kitchen table after Sunday dinner, which he had chosen specifically because Marjorie had been the first person in Painted Rock to be kind to Delia, and because he thought it mattered to ask in a place that already felt like family. He got down on one knee in Marjorie's kitchen with half of Painted Rock's social structure represented at the table, and he held a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small and perfect turquoise set in silver, and he asked Delia Hurst if she would marry him and stay in Painted Rock and build the life that they had both been working toward in their separate and then converging ways. Marjorie was already crying. The rancher Holt was pretending he had something in his eye. Jacob Holt was grinning. Delia looked at the ring and at the man holding it and felt everything she had closed off and protected and defended in herself open up like a door that had been locked for a long time and was now, finally, properly keyed. "Yes," she said. Emphatically yes. They married in April, in the small church at the north end of Painted Rock, on a morning that was warm and windy and brilliant with the particular gold light of a New Mexico spring. Delia wore a dress she and Marjorie had made together over the preceding weeks, cream-colored muslin with eyelet trim at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers that Rosa had gathered from the hills to the east. Cyrus stood at the altar in his good dark suit, and when she walked in and he saw her, his expression was so transparently and completely happy that the minister actually paused his reading to let the moment exist without competition. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, the ones that the church used, but when the minister reached the part about forsaking all others, both of them looked at each other with the particular weight of people who had already done a great deal of forsaking to get to this moment, who had let go of things and people and versions of themselves that had not been working, and who stood here now having arrived at something that was. "I do," Cyrus said. "I do," Delia said. Marjorie cried. Holt's eye was apparently bothering him again. Rosa threw her remaining wildflowers into the air because she was 9, and the moment required a dramatic gesture, and Cyrus kissed Delia in the small church in Painted Rock with the whole town watching and the spring wind moving through the open door and a feeling, for both of them, of something that had been long in coming and was therefore, when it arrived, more than they had let themselves expect. The wedding supper was at Briggs's saloon, the legitimate Painted Rock Briggs, who was no relation to the arrested Garrett Briggs in Albuquerque, and it lasted until past 10 o'clock and included the fiddle player from the Halloween social and the piano and a quantity of dancing that left Delia's feet pleasantly sore. She danced with Cyrus and with old Holt and with Sam the deputy and with Jacob and with a 90-year-old prospector who had been in the territory longer than anyone and who told her, while leading her through a surprisingly capable waltz, that she had picked the best man in 4 counties and she ought to know it. "I know it," she told him. She and Cyrus moved into a house on the western edge of town that he had owned since his 2nd year in Painted Rock, and had been living in with the comfortable minimalism of a man who used a space rather than inhabiting it. There was a main room and a kitchen and 2 small bedrooms, and a front porch that looked west toward the mountains, and a back garden that had been used for some storage but had the potential to be a real garden if someone applied themselves to it. Delia applied herself to it through the spring, not frantically but with the quiet pleasure of a woman who has found a use for her energy that belongs entirely to her and her own future. She planted kitchen herbs and sweet peas along the fence, and cleared the old lumber to make a proper space, and planted squash and beans and the tomatoes that needed, Marjorie told her, more sun than they were likely to get but that were worth trying regardless. She taught through the spring term and then through the summer session, which she established because she felt that too much of summer was wasted on children who needed occupation, and which attracted 8 of her 14 regular students whose parents were grateful for the arrangement. She wrote to her brother in Kansas City and told him she was married and happy, and that he should come visit, which he did in August, bringing his wife and 2 small children, and spending a week during which he met Cyrus and spent most of it in the company of the rancher Holt and Jacob, learning to ride better than he had previously managed, and left saying that he understood now why Delia had stayed. The letter from Garrett, the lawyer in Santa Fe, came in September of 1879, informing her that the divorce from Vincent Marchetti had been finalized in August. He had pleaded guilty to the lesser charges in the federal indictment and received a sentence of 5 years. The cattle ring had been effectively dismantled. The letter was thorough and complete, and when Delia finished reading it, she folded it carefully and placed it in the small tin box she kept in the bedroom that held important papers, and felt, as she did it, the closing of a chapter that had been open too long. She told Cyrus that evening on the porch, and he listened, and then he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things since she came here, without the defensive coloring that fear puts on everything. She felt, she said, like someone who has finished a very long walk and can now actually look at where they have arrived. "And where you've arrived," he said, watching her, "is exactly where I want to be," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it, and they sat on the porch in the September evening and watched the light go over the mountains. And it was in that moment, sitting quietly in the life she had built, that she recognized the particular quality of happiness that is not the dramatic and temporary kind, but the deep and durable kind, the kind that comes from having chosen rightly and known it over time. The first hint of what was growing between them in the most literal sense arrived in November of 1879, when Delia went to the doctor in Painted Rock, a capable and brisk man named Emery who had come to the territory from Philadelphia and adapted to it with impressive pragmatism, and learned that she was expecting a child in the early summer. She went home from the doctor's office through the cold November air with her hand pressed against her middle, and a feeling she could not immediately name, a kind of enormous and slightly terrifying gratitude. She was 28. She had thought on her darkest days in April and May that the life she had wanted, the particular version of it that included a real home and a real family, had been lost with the marriage, that she had spent it on something fraudulent and had nothing to show for it. The feeling of something fraudulent was very far away from where she was standing now. She waited until dinner. She had cooked the meal herself, the domestic skills that had never been particularly prized in her, but that she had discovered she actually enjoyed, and she served it. And when Cyrus reached for the salt, she said, very quietly, "We're going to need the second bedroom for something other than storage in June." He was still for one beat, then two. Then he turned his head and looked at her. "Delia," he said, just her name, but the way he said it said everything. She told him yes, absolutely yes, and he got up from his chair and came around the table and held her, and she held him back, and outside the window of their house in Painted Rock, the November wind moved through the streets of the town that had been her hiding place and had become her home. He was very good about all of it. He was attentive without being suffocating, which was important because Delia was not a woman who wanted to be treated as though her capability had decreased along with her waistline. He made sure the doctoring was in order and that she was not riding when it became inadvisable, and that the house was warm and that she was eating enough. All of this without making it into a performance of concern. It was simply the quiet, practical care that characterized everything he did, applied now to the most important thing either of them had. She taught until March, when the classroom became physically uncomfortable to navigate, and arranged with the territorial school board for a substitute teacher from Santa Fe to cover the remaining spring term. The substitute was a young woman named Frances who arrived in April and immediately impressed Rosa so thoroughly that Rosa asked Delia if she was going to stay. Delia told Rosa that she was coming back in September and that Frances was welcome to stay as a second teacher if the board approved it, because 14 students was more than one teacher could properly manage. This turned out to be exactly what happened. Frances stayed. The baby was born on the 5th of June, 1880, in the house on the western edge of Painted Rock, with the Dr. Emery in attendance and Marjorie Alcott serving as the irreplaceable practical support that she had been providing to every major event in Delia's life since she arrived in the territory. It was a boy, a healthy and insistently vocal boy, who arrived in the morning with the new light coming through the bedroom window and who looked, immediately upon arriving, as though he intended to have opinions about everything. Cyrus held him for the first time with the expression of a man who has been ambushed by something larger than his capacity to maintain composure, and said nothing for a long time, and then said to Delia, "He looks like someone who knows things." "He's 5 minutes old," Delia said, exhausted and euphoric. "Still," Cyrus said, not taking his eyes off the boy. They named him Thomas James Wallace, for no particular Thomas and for Cyrus's father James, and called him Tommy because Thomas was a full-grown name and he would need to earn it. He was the most demanding and the most completely compelling thing that had ever entered Delia's life, and she loved him with a totality that surprised her even though she had been expecting to love him since November. Rosa Aguilar came to see the baby the week after he was born and declared him acceptable, which was high praise from Rosa, and brought him a small carving of a horse that her father had made, which Delia placed on the windowsill of the second bedroom, which was now properly a nursery, not storage, and which had been repainted a soft white by Cyrus and Jacob Holt and the rancher Holt, all three of them on a Saturday in May, with a quantity of paint that had required 3 trips to Marjorie's store. The summer of 1880 passed in the particular haze of a first summer with a new baby, demanding and disorienting, and punctuated by moments of clarity so pure they felt like interruptions in ordinary time. Delia had not expected to be so good at it, or so consumed by it, or to find, in the dailiness of Tommy's first weeks and months, a kind of grounding that her life had not previously offered in quite this form. Cyrus was a father in the same way he was everything else, with presence and steadiness, and the particular quality of a man who does not perform competence but simply has it. He handled the night wakings without complaint and without requiring gratitude, and held Tommy during the long evenings in a way that made the boy settle immediately, and taught him, by October, to observe the world around him with the attentiveness that Cyrus brought to everything. He also arranged, in September, as he had promised almost a year earlier, to take Delia to meet Tosca of the Mescalero. They rode east on a clear September morning, leaving Tommy in Marjorie's very competent care, and met Tosca at the springs where the wild horses came to water. Tosca was an older man, perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone who has been in authority long enough that authority has become invisible in him, simply part of his nature. He spoke some English, and Cyrus spoke some of the language Tosca's band used, and between the two of them the conversation was possible. Tosca looked at Delia for a long time when they were introduced, and then said something to Cyrus. Cyrus translated. He said she had the eyes of someone who has survived something important. Delia said, through Cyrus, that she thought that was probably true, and that she was grateful for it. Tosca nodded as though this was the correct answer. He told her, through Cyrus, that the territory was not a gentle place, but that it made people who could endure, and that endurance was the rarest and most valuable quality in any person. He told her he was glad she had stayed. He told her, looking again at Cyrus, that her husband was a man who could be trusted, which in his experience was not a common thing, and that the arrangement between their communities was one of the few examples of something being handled honestly in a landscape otherwise characterized by its opposite. Delia thought of the injustice of everything that had been done to these people, the land taken, the traditional life dismantled, the particular cruelty of being made to negotiate for the right to exist in the place you had always existed. She did not say all of this because it was not the moment for it, and because Tosca did not need her to acknowledge what he knew better than anyone. But she held it, as she held many things, in the serious and attentive interior of herself, and it informed the way she taught her students in the fall, the careful truthfulness she tried to bring to the history she put before them. She and Cyrus rode back to Painted Rock in the late afternoon, with the mountains lit up behind them and the valley spreading away ahead of them. And she understood, riding beside him through the landscape that had terrified her in September of 1878, and that now felt as familiar as her own hand, why he had brought her here. Not only to meet Tosca, but to see the territory again from this angle at this time when she was no longer in it as a fugitive or a newcomer, but as someone who belonged to it. "You brought me here to show me something," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking ahead at the town in the distance. "What?" He glanced at her. "That it's yours too," he said. "Not just mine. Not just something you landed in. Yours." She looked at the valley, at the mountains, at the golden light, at the rooftops of Painted Rock in the distance. She thought about the schoolroom and the students and the garden with its tomatoes that had, against Marjorie's predictions, actually produced. She thought about Tommy in Marjorie's arms and the nursery with the horse carving on the windowsill. She thought about the porch and the evenings and the man riding beside her. "Yes," she said, "it is." The fall term of 1880 was the best she had taught, and she knew it. She and Francis had developed a working partnership that complemented their different strengths: Delia's fierce commitment to intellectual rigor, and Francis's natural warmth with the younger children. Rosa Aguilar was now reading material that would challenge a young adult, and Delia had written to a colleague she knew in Santa Fe about the possibility of Rosa continuing her education at a higher level when she aged out of the Painted Rock School. Thomas Holt had mastered arithmetic and was beginning algebra, which Delia had never expected to be teaching in a 400-person frontier town, but which she was teaching with considerable pleasure. She wrote to her brother again in October, a long letter this time, full of the details of Tommy and the school and the life she was living, and he wrote back that he was planning to move the family to Denver because the business opportunities there were better, and that Denver was not so far from New Mexico that they could not visit, and that he intended to visit every year. He kept this promise, as it turned out, and in subsequent years those annual visits became one of the rhythms of her life, another thread of continuity in a tapestry that was growing richer and more complex each year. In February of 1882, she was expecting again. This time it was easier in the physical sense, the knowing of what to expect reducing the anxiety, and she taught later in the term, until April, and the baby was born in October, and it was a girl, and they named her Clara Ann Wallace, the first name for Cyrus's first wife because Delia had proposed it and meant it without complication, because she understood that the love Cyrus had carried for Clara had not been replaced by the love he had for her but had been joined by it. That a person's capacity for love was not a fixed quantity that ran out, and because she wanted her daughter to carry the name of a woman who had been loved and who deserved to be remembered. Cyrus had been very quiet when she proposed the name, and then he had said thank you in a voice that was not entirely steady, and she had held his hand for a long time, and outside the window of the bedroom in their house, the October wind came down from the mountains and moved through the town as it had done every October since the town existed. Clara was a quieter baby than Tommy had been, serious and observant from very early, with Cyrus's habit of watching everything before making a decision. Tommy, by this point, was 2 years old and of the decided opinion that the household revolved around him, a theory that Clara's arrival put into significant dispute, which Tommy did not immediately accept but which he eventually adapted to, with the philosophical flexibility of a child being raised by two people who were good at thinking clearly. The years moved. This is the nature of years in a life that has become what it was supposed to be. They do not drag as they do when you are waiting for something, but they also do not race. They simply move with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its own tempo, full of the small events and daily textures that do not make headlines, but that constitute the actual substance of happiness. Cyrus was still the sheriff of Painted Rock, and would be for another 4 years yet before they would ask him to run for the territorial assembly, which was another story entirely. He was good at it in the way that people who are suited to their work are good at it, not through effort but through correspondence, the job fitting the person in a way that made both better. He kept the peace in Painted Rock with the same combination of firm principle and human understanding that characterized everything he did, and the town was, for its size and its era, a remarkably civil place. Delia was still the head teacher of the Painted Rock School, which had grown by 1884 to 23 students and required Francis full-time and a part-time third teacher, a retired schoolmaster from back east named Pemberton who taught the older boys mathematics and Latin in the afternoons. She had also established, in 1883, a lending library attached to the school, which operated on Thursday evenings and Saturday mornings, and which was funded partly by a small fee and partly by donations from residents of the town, who had gradually come to understand that the schoolteacher took the intellectual life of their community personally. Rosa Aguilar was 15 in 1884 and reading philosophy, which Delia had obtained for her by the roundabout method of writing to every person she knew in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Kansas City and requesting books, and Rosa had declared her intention to become a teacher herself, which Delia considered one of the most satisfying outcomes she had ever been part of. The garden behind the house had become a real garden. The tomatoes were legendary. The sweet peas came back every year in a different color because Delia saved seeds selectively, which she had taught herself from a book obtained through the lending library. And in summer the back fence was a kind of dense and riotous beauty that Tommy and Clara played in front of, and that Delia tended with the same focused attention she brought to everything she loved. In the summer of 1884, on an evening in July when the light was long and golden and Tommy was 4, and Clara was 1.5 and the porch was full of the sound of an ordinary evening in their life, Delia sat beside Cyrus on the porch with the baby asleep in her arms and Tommy at their feet examining a beetle with the intense scientific focus that was already beginning to look like something specific. And she said, without premeditation, "I was so afraid of this." Cyrus looked at her. "Of what?" "Of this," she said. She indicated with a small motion of her head all of it, the porch and the children and the town and the evening and him. "Of wanting something this much and not being allowed to have it." He was quiet for a moment. And now I have it," she said, "and it's not at all frightening, it's just," she paused looking for the word, "real, it's just real." He put his arm around her and the sleeping baby and pulled them both close, and she leaned against him in the warm July evening, and the beetle held Tommy's attention for another 3 minutes before he came to show it to them, holding it carefully in both cupped hands with a seriousness that made Cyrus try to keep a straight face and fail entirely. And the sound of his laughter in the warm evening was, Delia thought, the most ordinary and most complete sound she had ever heard. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, of the woman she had been in April of 1878, standing in the kitchen of the Albuquerque house with the ledger open on the table, and the particular cold clarity of a person who has just seen the truth of a situation they have been living in without understanding. That woman had been brave, she thought, braver than she had given herself credit for at the time, brave in the way that people are brave when they have no other option, which is often the truest kind of bravery. She had made her mistakes. She had made them and owned them and carried them and set them down, not because the territory forgave mistakes, because it did not, because the land and the time she lived in were not in the business of forgiveness, but because she did not need the territory to forgive her. She had done it herself, which was harder and more lasting and the only kind that actually counted. Cyrus had told her, on that night in the sheriff's office with the oil lamp burning and the gun on his desk, and the distance between them that had felt so permanent and been so temporary, that the territory did not forgive mistakes. And she had told him she had made hers and was done with them. And she had meant it in the way that only the truth means things, completely and without qualification. She had been done with them. She was done with them still. What she was not done with was this, any of this, the work and the town and the man and the children and the garden and the students and the porch and the mountains in the distance, and the particular quality of the light in this valley on a July evening in 1884. She was not done with any of it. She intended, in fact, to be very thorough about continuing with all of it for a very long time. Tommy came onto the porch one morning in September of 1884, 5 years old now, and possessed of a certainty about his own ideas that was both exhausting and deeply familiar, and announced that he wanted to learn to ride his own horse, not sit on the horse behind his father, but ride one of his own. Cyrus had looked at Delia over Tommy's head, and she had looked back at him, and a conversation had passed between them in the way that conversations passed between them now, in expressions and the slight movements of faces that had learned each other's language fully. "Talk to Jacob Holt," Cyrus said. "He has a mare who foaled in the spring. The foal's old enough to start gentle work." Tommy had taken off at a run toward the Holt ranch, which was within walking distance of town, before either of them could qualify this with any safety instructions, and they had both stood up from the breakfast table and followed him because he was 5 and therefore could not be permitted to negotiate with Jacob Holt entirely unsupervised. Jacob had agreed to teach Tommy to ride on the foal, named Beige for the obvious reason, and the lessons began the following Saturday and became a fixture of the weeks that followed. Delia watched from the fence of the Holt paddock the first time Tommy sat on Beige's back, and watched her son's face go from the particular terror of something new and large to the particular exhilaration of something new and large, and watched Cyrus at the fence beside her doing the same thing she was doing, which was trying to look relaxed and failing. "He'll be fine," Cyrus said. "I know," she said. "He's got your stubbornness," Cyrus said. "He won't fall off on principle." She laughed and leaned against the fence rail and watched her son ride a horse for the first time in the September morning in the New Mexico territory, and thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in this territory with a trunk and a carpetbag and a hidden ledger, and a name she was reclaiming, and thought about all the distances between that moment and this one, and found that the distance was exactly sufficient, and the arrival was exactly right. Clara Wallace was a walker by October of 1884 and a talker by November, with opinions about everything delivered in a vocabulary that impressed even Francis and absolutely devastated the patience of Marjorie Alcott and anyone else who came within conversational range of her. She had Delia's brown hair and Cyrus's gray eyes, and a disposition that combined the most determined qualities of both of her parents, in a combination that suggested she was going to be an extraordinary person, and possibly also a profoundly inconvenient one. Marjorie Alcott became Clara's particular champion, possibly because Clara's personality and Marjorie's had a certain structural similarity, and the two of them could be found most Saturday mornings in the general store, having an extremely serious conversation about the week's inventory that did not involve Clara purchasing anything, but nonetheless reflected her considerable views on the matter. Christmas of 1884 was the fullest Delia had known, her brother and his family coming down from Denver for the week, the house too small for everyone and not mattering at all, the dinners crowded and loud and entirely satisfying. Her brother had become genuinely fond of Cyrus over the years of his visits, and they had developed a friendship of their own, the kind that springs up between men who recognize each other's quality and are direct enough to acknowledge it. They sat on the porch late into the Christmas Eve night talking, while Delia and her sister-in-law put the children to bed, and she could hear their voices through the window, low and easy and occasionally punctuated by laughter. And she had that feeling again, the one that was the durable and not temporary kind, the one that came from having chosen rightly. She had written to Alderman Pike once in 1880 to ask about the final outcome of the cases against Vincent Marchetti and Dutch Selden and the others. Pike had responded promptly and with evident satisfaction. Marchetti had served his sentence and, as far as Pike knew, had returned to the eastern states his family came from and was no longer operating in the territories. Selden was serving a longer sentence and would be for some time. The cattle ring was completely dismantled. The men whose names had appeared in the Albuquerque Sheriff's office columns of the ledger had been quietly removed from their positions. It was not, Pike wrote, everything that justice would have asked for, but it was considerably more than usually happened. She had read the letter and then burned it, not because it contained anything dangerous, but because she was done with that chapter and had no desire to keep a document from it. She had written a brief note of thanks to Pike and left it there. The ledger was someone else's problem now. It had been testimony and evidence and the instrument of prosecutions that had, whatever their limitations, made the territory safer for the people who lived in it. What it had been for Delia was a burden she had carried for as long as was necessary and then given over. That was enough. That was the right thing. Spring came again to Painted Rock in 1885, the fifth spring she had seen from the porch of the house on the western edge of town, and she stood in her garden in April looking at the sweet peas coming up along the fence, the first green shoots of them against the adobe wall, and felt the particular pleasure of watching a thing you have made grow from its own roots. Tommy was in school, in her own classroom, which was an arrangement that required a certain amount of professional discipline on her part and an equivalent amount of strategic restraint on his. Clara was with Marjorie, as she was every morning while Delia taught. Cyrus had ridden out early to look at a situation on the eastern range, a boundary dispute between two ranch families that had been heating up since winter, and that required his particular combination of legal authority and common sense to resolve without escalating. He would be back by afternoon. She was kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into the earth with the directness of someone who has learned what care actually looks like and is not frightened by the getting dirty of it, when she heard the gate and looked up to find him coming through it, earlier than expected, and he had the look of a man who has resolved something successfully and is now thinking about the next thing. He stopped when he saw her kneeling in the garden and stood at the gate for a moment, just looking at her in the way he had, that unguarded and unhurried quality of attention. "How did it go?" she asked. "Resolved," he said, "more or less. The Hannigan family agreed to a survey and the Burkes agreed to accept the survey result. It'll take a few weeks to set up, but it won't turn into anything worse." She nodded and pressed another seed into the soil. He came across the garden and crouched down beside her with the ease of a man who is comfortable with the ground, and picked up a handful of the earth and felt it between his fingers. "Good soil this year," he said. Marjorie said the winter was wet enough to help, she said. They were quiet for a moment, both of them in the garden in the April morning, and then he said, "I had a letter last week, from the Territorial Assembly's organizing committee, about the fall." She looked up at him. This was the thing she had been half expecting since the previous autumn, when several of the territory's leading citizens had begun floating his name in conversations about territorial representation. "And," she said, "and I told them I wanted to talk to you before I said anything one way or the other," he said. He was looking at her directly, the serious and honest look that she had known from very early as the look that meant he was saying something that mattered. Because it would change things here, the schedule, the travel. It would be important work, she said. "Yes," he said, "but so is this." He indicated the town around them, the work he did as its sheriff. "And I'm not interested in important work that costs us something we can't replace." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had told her on their first real conversation that the territory did not forgive mistakes, who had then proved, over the years since, that he himself was considerably more forgiving than the territory, that the steadiness she had identified in him from the very first was not rigidity but something better, the flexibility of a person who is rooted enough to bend without breaking. "I think you should do it," she said. if that's what you want. The school is in good hands. Tommy's old enough to understand if you're away sometimes. Clara will be impossible to manage without you, but she's impossible to manage with you too, so that's not a significant change. She paused. And I'll be here, I'm not going anywhere. He held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, that quality of being undone by good things that he had never quite lost. You are, he said, the most reasonable person I have ever met. I'm not, she said. I'm actually quite stubborn. You've adapted to it so well you've stopped noticing. He laughed, and it was the laugh she loved most, the unguarded one. And then he leaned forward and kissed her in the garden with the spring morning around them and the seeds in the ground and the sweet peas coming up against the adobe wall. And she kissed him back with everything she was, the woman who had come here hiding and had stayed here living, who had made her mistakes and set them down and built instead this, all of this life that was real and solid and entirely, completely, wholly hers. Tommy's voice announced itself from the direction of the street before the gate opened, because Tommy at 5 had never in his life arrived anywhere quietly. And then the gate did open, and he was in the garden telling them both about something that had happened with Beige that morning, something involving a fence and a crow and a bucket of water. The account of it so detailed and so earnest, and so very much the account of a specific 5-year-old that both of them were laughing by the end of it. Clara was retrieved from Marjorie at noon and declared that she intended to learn to read before the end of the year, which was ambitious for a 2-year-old but not, given who her mother was, entirely implausible. Delia made lunch. Cyrus helped, because they had divided the household work on pragmatic rather than conventional lines a long time ago. Tommy set the table with the careful pride of a child performing an important function. Clara sat in her chair and supervised everything with the authority of someone who had decided that supervision was her primary contribution to the household economy. They ate lunch around the table in the kitchen of the house on the western edge of Painted Rock, in the New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1885, and the sun came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a long, warm bar of light. And outside the garden waited with its seeds in the ground and its sweet peas against the wall. And outside the garden the town went about its business. And outside the town the territory spread in all directions. Enormous and indifferent and not in the business of forgiveness. It did not need to be. The forgiveness had happened inside, between people who had been honest enough and brave enough and patient enough to find their way toward each other through the dark past, and the hidden motives and the secrets and the forced choices and all the machinery of a life that had tried to be other than it was before it finally managed to be exactly what it was supposed to be. Delia Hurst Wallace set down her coffee cup and looked at her husband across the kitchen table, at the man who had told her the territory did not forgive mistakes, and thought that she was done with her mistakes, had been done with them since the evening she walked into his office and said so, and that what she was not done with and did not intend to be done with was this: the man and the children and the town and the garden and the life and the love that had grown between them as stubbornly and as thoroughly as the sweet peas along the fence, coming back every year in different colors, rooted and alive and continuously, irrepressibly, reaching toward the light.